The Great Debate by Yuval Levin, continued. Disc 9. Burke's Eternal Order. Beginning from a very different premise, Edmund Burke comes to an entirely different view of the appropriate relations between the generations. His own understanding of politics puts not abstract natural freedom, but concrete inheritance at the very core, and emphasizes obligation over choice. Burke believes that what we owe the future, above all, is not freedom, but rather the accumulated wisdom and work of the past. The task of any generation is to preserve and, where necessary and possible, improve what that generation has been given by its predecessors, with the aim of passing the benefit along to its successors. Each generation must live with a sense of its own time as transitory, more or less the opposite of an eternal now. As noted, Burke sees society as a relationship not just between the living, but also between the living, the dead, and the people of the future. Society exists not to facilitate individual choice, but to meet the needs of the people, and to do so, it must draw on the wisdom of the past and be guided by the imperative to make that wisdom available to future generations as well, supplemented by lessons learned by the current generation along the way. I attest the retiring, I attest the advancing generations, between which, as a link in the great chain of eternal order, we stand, Burke told the House of Lords in the course of the impeachment trial of Hastings. A great deal of Burke's work is built on this sense that the present is fleeting and best understood as a link in a chain, and his focus on this question grows especially pronounced in the years of the French Revolution. Burke believes that the present generation has profound obligations both to the past and to the future, and that these obligations offer an important benefit to the present generation by imposing crucial constraints upon its ambitions and its reach. Society can thrive only within such constraints, and therefore with a sense of itself as linked to the past and the future. Without these constraints, all the lessons of history would be denied to the present and the future, and personal self-sufficiency and arrogance, the certain attendance upon all those who have never experienced a wisdom greater than their own, would usurp the tribunal. Burke expressly denies that we can look out for the needs of the future even as we reject the lessons and achievements of the past. Access to those lessons and achievements is one of the most crucial needs of the future, as he sees it, so the present-centered vision of the revolutionaries must involve betraying the future as much as the past. People will not look forward to posterity, who never look backward to their ancestors. A free and ordered society will look to both, Burke argues. One of the first and most leading principles on which the Commonwealth and the laws are consecrated is lest the temporary possessors and life renters in it, unmindful of what they have received from their ancestors or of what is due to their posterity, should act as if they were the entire masters, that they should not think it amongst their rights to cut off the entail or commit waste on the inheritance, by destroying at their pleasure the whole original fabric of their society, hazarding to leave to those who come after them a ruin instead of a habitation, and teaching these successors as little respect to their contrivances as they had themselves respected the institutions of their forefathers. In order to build anything lasting, Burke suggests, we must respect what has been built in the past and how it has come down to us. The idea of inheritance for Burke explains not only the descent of property and title, but also the descent of rights and obligations, which Paine takes to derive directly from the individual, but which Burke believes are a function of one's relation to the past. Burke stresses that because men are born into civil society without their own consent, their rights in that society are a function not of their agreeing to certain arrangements, but of their inheritance from their forefathers, who had worked to defend those rights just as members of this new generation should for themselves and their posterity. In defending the accumulated achievements of the past, however, Burke defends not only social relations and ordered freedom, but also precisely the kind of inherited property and privileges that Paine so opposes. Burke argues that the noble families of Britain are essential to the nation's stability and success, and provide a source of strength that a fully democratic republic could never attain. In an extraordinary letter to the Duke of Richmond in 1772, Burke writes, "You people of great families and hereditary trusts and fortunes are not like such as I am, who, whatever may be the rapidity of our growth, and even by the fruit we bear, and flatter ourselves a little that, while we creep on the ground, we belly into melons that are exquisite for size and flavor, yet still we are but annual plants that perish with our season, and leave no sort of traces behind us. You, if you are what you ought to be, are in my eye the great oaks that shade a country, and perpetuate your benefits from generation to generation." Though not blind to the dark side of the aristocracy, Burke rejects Paine's assertion that nothing of much consequence transpires at the junction of the generations. He argues that the strength and stability made possible by the aristocracy are worth the cost, and that in any case, no plausible alternative exists as a means of perpetuation. Burke also expressly disagrees with Paine's assertion that a republic allows for institutions that reach beyond the lifespans of individuals. Republican institutions are never secure, Burke argues, because they accept no authority but the present. They conceive, very systematically, that all things which give perpetuity are mischievous, and therefore they are at inexpiable war with all establishments, Burke writes of the revolutionaries. No one can ever plan ahead securely in a republic, Burke argues, because the rules could change at any point on a momentary whim of today's majority. Only cross-generational institutions and the great aristocratic families offer a real solution to the challenge of establishing arrangements that will outlive their founders. This nobility forms the chain that connects the ages of a nation which otherwise, with Mr. Paine, would soon be taught that no one generation can bind another, Burke argues. Whereas individuals come and go, the Commonwealth is more permanent. Precisely because of this difference, laws and practices that span generations are essential, so that society as a whole may persist as a body which, in juridical construction, never dies, and in fact never loses its members at once by death. Or as Burke puts it in the Reflections, "Our political system is placed in a just correspondence and symmetry with the order of the world, and with the mode of existence decreed to a permanent body composed of transitory parts, wherein, by the disposition of a stupendous wisdom, molding together the great mysterious incorporation of the human race, the whole at one time is never old, or middle-aged, or young, but in a condition of unchangeable constancy, moves on through the varied tenor of perpetual decay, fall, renovation, and progression." Burke and Paine thus employ very similar language, the language of a regime always in its prime, to argue for thoroughly opposite notions of the relations between the generations in the design of political institutions. For Burke, it is not by separating the generations, but by joining them, that we ensure that society is not debilitated by human mortality. Society flourishes not by freeing every generation from those that precede and succeed it, so that it might have direct recourse to permanent principles, but by linking the generations tightly together so that they might form a permanent body. If the whole chain and continuity of the Commonwealth would be broken, and no one generation could link with the other, Burke worries, then men would become little better than the flies of a summer. The Commonwealth, as a work of many generations intended to last for many more, requires an explicitly intergenerational character. It exists not in an eternal now, but rather as the product of a lengthy and still ongoing process, one in which time is of very great significance, and therefore in which the generations must take part together. Where the great interests of mankind are concerned through a long succession of generations, Burke writes, that succession ought to be admitted into some share in the counsels which are so deeply to affect them. If justice requires this, the work itself requires the aid of more minds than one age can furnish. Thomas Paine, as we have seen, believes that this view subordinates the interests of the present and the future to those of the past, as it would deny every generation but the first a full share in self-government. But Burke argues that far from sacrificing the present and the future, he is defending both from being robbed of their inheritance. It is the revolutionaries who would sacrifice the interests of the present by subjecting the present generation to the instability and danger of the revolution itself, and risk the inheritance of the future on a gamble. In political arrangements, men have no right to put the well-being of the present generation wholly out of the question, he writes. Perhaps the only moral trust with any certainty in our hands is the care of our own time. With regard to futurity, we are to treat it like a ward. We are not so to attempt an improvement of his fortune as to put the capital of his estate to any hazard. That capital, to which the present and the future are entitled, is the accumulated knowledge and practice of their forefathers. The radicals, Burke argues, seek to deprive men of the benefit of the collected wisdom of mankind and to make them blind disciples of their own particular presumption. He therefore sees himself as a defender of the present, not the past, and sees the revolutionaries as a threat to present happiness as well as to future order. Our first trust is the happiness of our own time. Even if their plans had some chance of succeeding, Burke suggests, the revolutionaries' treatment of the present generation is therefore a dereliction of the statesman's foremost duty. And of course, for the very same reason, he also thinks their plans will fail. Because the revolutionaries do not grasp the actual character of human society, they direct themselves to the wrong ends altogether. In rejecting the accumulated achievements of the past, they reject an entire approach to political life and an entire view of the nature of man and society. Their other errors, as Burke sees it, errors about human nature and justice, human obligations and freedom, human reason and knowledge, and political change and reform, result from and also describe the same underlying view. The politics of the given world. Anyone exploring the views of Burke and Paine will repeatedly encounter, as we have, the question of context, both social and generational. Again and again, Paine defends the prerogatives of the individual and derides all that presses upon his freedom of action. Again and again, Burke insists that no man is an island, and no individual exists apart from society. Two sets of concerns, those regarding the individual and the community, and those regarding the present and the past, are therefore constant themes of both Burke's and Paine's political thought. Paine believes that human beings are best understood apart from the community and the past, as complete and sufficient individuals endowed with natural rights whose interactions are functions of their individual choices and actions. Both tradition and society should be put aside when contemplating questions of political principle and action, because both are consequences of politics, not sources of it. Burke believes that human beings are best understood in their social and historical settings as members of their communities with obligations to each other, and as recipients of a valuable inheritance from the past, an inheritance that they are charged to improve and pass along. But as we review the particulars of the Burke-Paine debate laid out in the previous chapters, these two sets of concerns about tradition and community appear to collapse into one. The argument over tradition and the past encompasses the dispute over community for both Burke and Paine. It is the given world, those conditions we are born into without choice, that to Burke's eyes make the theory of individualism inadequate. Because human generations are not independent of one another, human individuals are not independent of one another either. The facts of human birth and death and the social institutions built around them link individuals, families, and communities inexorably, and to pretend otherwise, let alone to sever their links, would be disastrous for political life. For Paine, meanwhile, the theory of individualism relies on an explanatory device, the state of nature, that takes the first human generation as its model, a generation for whom there was no given past. To apply a theory based on that premise is to deny the authority and significance of human generations and thus of tradition, and Paine is not shy about making that clear. The independence of individuals from their neighbors is a function of the independence of generations from their predecessors. This independence in the first generation is the essence of the theory of Enlightenment liberalism, which applies its timeless principles to all subsequent generations as well. Thus, a crucial common thread in the large and varied debates between Burke and Paine is apparently a dispute about the status of the past in political life. And both Burke and Paine are exceptionally explicit about its significance and take up the question of the meaning of the past in an uncommonly overt way. Paine's abhorrence of inherited government is the core of his political philosophy, for he sees inherited government as essentially opposed to nature, choice, reason, and justice. He wants to look past history and tradition to nature, and therefore to look past given obligations to created choices, beyond received wisdom to pure reason, and beyond mere cumulative reforms to total revolution. Burke, meanwhile, says the model of inheritance is the model of nature, the appropriate means of understanding and meeting our obligations, the core of prescription, and the key to reform. Both men are students of political change, and in a certain respect, all of the themes taken up in this book are aspects of a dispute about change, its purpose, its character, its means, and its ends. But Burke's and Paine's views of the matter always clearly draw on this deep disagreement about the nature and meaning of the relations between generations. For Paine, the disjunction between the permanent principles of politics and the inherited realities of social and political life demands a revolutionary transformation, a break with the past to bring the real into alignment with the ideal made known by reason. For Burke, the evolved forms of political life, which are a valued inheritance, offer both the means and the ends of political change. When problems arise, society can employ its political institutions to address them, as those institutions have developed slowly over time to serve that purpose. But when a problem is too large for those institutions to contend with and thereby threatens their survival, statesmen must reform the institutions in an effort to strengthen and preserve them, so that these institutions might be passed down to future generations who will use them in the same way. This arrangement calls for gradual change in response to discrete needs and problems, informed by a profound respect for the given order, because for Burke, the real is the only reliable means of grasping the ideal. Here we find the true bottom of the Burke-Paine debate, and from here we can begin to appreciate how their differences have helped to shape our own. They disagreed about whether some basic aspects of the human condition, especially the facts that we are all born and that we all die, should decisively shape human societies. Paine's assertive, confident, rationalist, technocratic, and progressive outlook held that through the right kinds of political arrangements, man could overcome the limits that these facts might impose, and he could therefore reshape his world to his preferences and even end the long-standing scourges of injustice, war, and suffering. Burke's grateful, protective, cautious, pious, gradualist, and reformist outlook held that man could only hope to improve his circumstances if he understood his own limits, built on the achievements of those who came before him to repair their errors, and realized that some profound human miseries and vices are permanent functions of our nature, and that pretending otherwise would only make them worse. Both are modern attitudes, and both are liberal too, but they disagree about just what modernity and liberalism mean. Indeed, that very disagreement has ultimately come to define modern liberalism. Conclusion. Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine knew that the heated controversies that had shaped their public lives would not end with their deaths. In fact, both of them worried that they might not be allowed to rest in peace, quite literally. As he lay ill in 1797, Burke expressed his dread that should the French radicals and their allies in Britain succeed in spreading their revolution across the Channel, they would exhume his body from its resting place to make an example of their staunch opponent. He gave instructions that he should be buried in an unmarked grave kept apart from that of his son and from the plot reserved for his wife, so that his fate need not be theirs. In the end, Burke's family and friends decided to follow the guidance of his written will instead of this fevered deathbed plea, and he was buried alongside his son in a grave bearing the family name in a Beaconsfield churchyard, where his wife joined them some 15 years later. Paine, too, found himself uneasy about the fate of his earthly remains, and reasoned that his enemies, whom he assumed would be motivated by his writings against biblical religion, would be deterred only by the sanctity of a Christian cemetery. The adamant deist, if not atheist, therefore, ironically sought ultimate protection under the religion of his fathers, leaving this request in his will. I know not if the society of people called Quakers admit a person to be buried in their burying ground who does not belong to their society, but if they do, or will admit me, I would prefer being buried there. My father belonged to that profession, and I was partly brought up in it. But if it is not consistent with their rules to do this, I desire to be buried on my own farm at New Rochelle. The Quakers in the end did not allow it, and Paine was indeed buried on his farm. His fears, moreover, turned out to be better founded than Burke's, if not quite for the reasons he expected. 10 years after his death, Paine's remains were surreptitiously removed from his New Rochelle grave by William Cobbett, an English radical who sought to take the body to Britain and erect a glorious memorial to his hero. But Paine's anti-monarchical views had not been forgotten in Britain, and the government refused to permit a monument. Cobbett's gambit turned into a fiasco and made him a national laughingstock. Worse yet, Paine's remains were eventually lost. Their final disposition remains unknown to this day. Burke's and Paine's exceptional concerns about their legacies should not surprise us. They were right to assume that their names and their words, if not their mortal remains, would not be left to rest, but would continue to play key roles in the great debate they had helped launch. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, and into the 21st, both have been frequently appealed to by various political movements. Assorted radical leaders the world over, from the American abolitionist firebrand John Brown to Uruguayan liberator José Gervasio Artigas and countless others in between, laid claim to the legacy of Thomas Paine, as did the mainstream labor and progressive movements in the Anglo-American world. Conservative cultural and political movements, from Romantic poets to reforming Tories to the conservative movement that emerged in America in the middle of the last century, have laid claim to Edmund Burke's name and ideas. Ironically, our understanding of the Burke-Paine debate has actually suffered some from such persistent political attention to both men. The revolutionaries who adopted Paine as their own would too often infuse his historical memory with socialist sensibilities that would have been largely foreign to Paine himself. And a great deal of the commentary and even the scholarship regarding Burke, particularly over the past century, has seemed to want to make him even more temperamentally conservative than he was, in the process overlooking important strains in his thinking. There has been some modest tempering of these tendencies in both cases, if sometimes through equal and opposite distortions. Paine's role in the American Revolution, for instance, has caused some American conservatives to give him a serious look and to emphasize elements of his worldview they find agreeable. No less an icon of the American right than Ronald Reagan accepted the Republican Party's nomination for president in 1980 by reminding his supporters of Paine's call for transforming failed governing institutions. Burke's emphasis on gradualism, meanwhile, has appealed to some contemporary liberals eager to resist dramatic transformations of the welfare state. No less an icon of the American left than Barack Obama has reportedly described himself as a Burkean eager to avoid sudden change. But it is not in these uses and abuses of Burke's and Paine's own names and reputations that we can find the lasting legacy of their debate. By considering the arguments as each man first made them, and not as assorted partisans across 2 centuries have sought to use them, we can see how the worldviews Burke and Paine laid out still describe 2 broad and fundamental dispositions toward political life and political change in our liberal age. The tensions between those 2 dispositions comes down to some very basic questions. Should our society be made to answer to the demands of stark and abstract commitments to ideals like social equality or to the patterns of its own concrete political traditions and foundations? Should the citizen's relationship to his society be defined above all by the individual right of free choice, or by a web of obligations and conventions not entirely of our own choosing? Are great public problems best addressed through institutions designed to apply the explicit technical knowledge of experts, or by those designed to channel the implicit social knowledge of the community? Should we see each of our society's failings as one large problem to be solved by comprehensive transformation, or as a set of discrete imperfections to be addressed by building on what works tolerably well to address what does not? What authority should the character of the given world exercise over our sense of what we would like it to be? These questions build on one another, and step by subtle step, they add up to quite distinct ways of thinking about politics. Every person looks upon his country and sees a mix of good things and bad. But which strike us more powerfully? In confronting the society around us, are we first grateful for what works well about it and move to reinforce and build on that? Or are we first outraged by what works poorly and move to uproot and transform it? Our answers will tend to shape how we think about particular political questions. Do we want to fix our healthcare system by empowering expert panels armed with the latest effectiveness data to manage the system from the center, or by arranging economic incentives to channel consumer knowledge and preferences and address some of the system's discrete problems? Do we want to alleviate poverty through large national programs that use public dollars to supplement the incomes of the poor, or through efforts to build on the social infrastructure of local civil society institutions to help the poor build the skills and habits to rise? Do we want problems addressed through the most comprehensive and broadest possible means, or through the most minimal and targeted ones? People's answers to such questions likely fall into a pattern, and the answers depend not only on our opinion of the state of our particular society at this moment, but also on our assumptions about how much knowledge and power social reformers can really expect to have, and of what sort. Ultimately, the answers depend as well on people's implicit notion of what our political order, what modern liberalism really is exactly. Is it a set of principles that were discovered by Enlightenment philosophers and that should be put more and more completely into practice so that our society can increasingly resemble those philosophers' ideal mix of egalitarianism and liberty? Or is it a living culture built up over countless generations of social trial and error so that by the time of the Enlightenment, especially in Britain, society had taken a form that allowed for an exceptional mix of egalitarianism and liberty? Is liberalism, in other words, a theoretical discovery to be put into effect or practical achievement to be reinforced and perfected? These two possibilities suggest two rather different sorts of liberal politics: a politics of vigorous progress toward an ideal goal, or a politics of preservation and perfection of a precious inheritance. They suggest, in other words, a progressive liberalism and a conservative liberalism. The two parties to our political debates still very often answer to these general descriptions. But of course, they do not answer to them perfectly or quite consistently. Burke and Paine offer us a window into the birth of the right and the left. But to see the birth of an idea is not to see its developed state. How both the right and the left have changed from the views laid out by Burke and Paine is at least as interesting as how their views have persisted. This book can, of course, barely scratch the surface of that complex evolution. But even the very broadest outlines can help us see how Burke and Paine remain deeply relevant, both as instructive points of origin and as useful correctives for today's right and left. The fundamental utopian goal at the core of Paine's thinking, the goal of liberating the individual from the constraints of the obligations imposed upon him by his time, his place, and his relations to others, remains essential to the left in America. But the failure of Enlightenment liberal principles and the institutions built upon them to deliver on that bold ambition, and therefore on Paine's hopes of eradicating prejudice, poverty, and war, seemed to force the left into a choice between the natural rights theories that Paine thought would offer means of attaining his goal and the goal itself. In time, the utopian goal was given preference, and a vision of the state as a direct provider of basic necessities and largely unencumbered by the restraints of Paine's Enlightenment liberalism arose to advance it. We can begin to discern the earliest roots of this way of thinking in Paine's own later revolutionary writings, when he proposes a primordial welfare state. But it advanced a fair bit from Paine's views, as over time, some American progressives, influenced by European social democratic thinking, came to believe in an assertive national government. They thought such a government could both provide some material benefits and clear away some of the social and civic institutions that stood between the individual and the state, institutions that they considered, as Paine did, carriers of backwardness and prejudice. In this way, the government could free people simultaneously from material want and from direct moral obligations to those immediately around them. Such a government would make people more equal to one another and freer of one another, and thus better able to exercise their individual choices. Today's left plainly exhibits this combination of material collectivism and moral individualism. The role it affords to the government and its links to European social thought might at first suggest that this attitude leans toward communitarianism. But its American form is actually a radical form of individualism, moved by much the same passion for justice that Paine had, and by much the same desire to free people of the fetters of tradition, religion, and the moral or social expectations of those around them. The deep commitment to generational continuity and to the institutions of implicit social knowledge that we have found at the core of Burke's thought remains essential to today's American right, meanwhile. But as Burke himself noted, different societies form such institutions differently, And Americans in particular have always been men of free character and spirit to an exceptional degree. This, and the simple fact that American conservatives are conserving a political tradition begun in a revolution, even if it was not as radical a revolution as Paine insists, has long made the American right more inclined both to resort to theory and to appeal to individualism than Burke was. And the two tendencies are connected. The theory of American political thought most often and most readily at hand for today's conservatives is an adaptation of the very same natural rights theories that Paine, Jefferson, and other Enlightenment liberal founders of America had championed, but which the left eventually abandoned. The tradition of conservative liberalism, the gradual accumulation of practices and institutions of freedom and order that Burke celebrated as the English Constitution, and that in many important respects the American Revolution sought to preserve, not to reject, on this side of the Atlantic, has only rarely been articulated in American terms. For this reason, it is not often heard on the lips of today's conservatives. And yet, this very same conservative liberalism is very frequently the vision they pursue in practice. It is the vision conservatives advance when they defend traditional social institutions and the family, seek to make our culture more hospitable to children, and rail against attempts at technocratic expert government. It is the vision they uphold when they insist on an allegiance to our forefathers' constitutional forms, warn of the dangers of burdening our children with debt to fund our own consumption, or insist that the sheer scope and ambition of our government makes it untenable. Today's left, therefore, shares a great portion of Paine's basic disposition, but seeks to liberate the individual in a rather less quixotic and more technocratic way than Paine did, if also in a way that lacks his grounding in principle and natural right. Thus, today's liberals are left philosophically adrift and far too open to the cold logic of utilitarianism. They could learn from Paine's insistence on limits to the use of power and the role of government. Today's right, meanwhile, shares a great deal of Burke's basic disposition, but seeks to protect our cultural inheritance in a less aristocratic and, naturally for Americans, more populist way than he did, if also in a way that lacks his emphasis on community and on the sentiments. Today's conservatives are thus too rhetorically strident and far too open to the siren song of hyper-individualism, and they generally lack a non-radical theory of the liberal society. They could benefit by adopting Burke's focus on the social character of man, from Burke's thoroughgoing gradualism, and from his innovative liberal alternative to Enlightenment radicalism. Both sides of our politics, therefore, exhibit in practice deep continuities to their intellectual forerunners, despite being barely aware of these connections, and would be well served by better understanding them. Each group might find some of its worst excesses alleviated a bit by carefully considering the Burke-Paine debate. One peculiar feature of some prominent contemporary policy debates can make this historical continuity of the left-right divide particularly difficult to see, and so is worth a further word. As the great economic debate of the last century has loosened its grip on our politics with the fall of communism and the waning of socialist ideas, American political life has come to be defined by the social democratic welfare state and its mounting difficulties. Today's progressives are thus often engaged in a struggle to preserve a set of public entitlement programs that their predecessors built over the past century, often employing arguments that, in the cause of preservation, sound downright Burkean. Meanwhile, today's conservatives seek to transform some key governing institutions, often resorting to arguments from classic liberal principles that ring of Paine. The rhetoric of some key domestic debates, therefore, sometimes seems almost like a mirror image of the original left-right debate. But this is a kind of second-order argument about political change, a debate about reforming a set of welfare state institutions that are themselves intended to advance a certain vision of change. The vision is a progressive archetype that Paine would certainly have recognized, an egalitarian ideal of justice advanced through the application of technical expertise regarding society within a liberal framework. Opposing it is a more conservative ideal that Burke would have found familiar, a case for addressing social problems through evolved institutions like the family, civil society, religious groups, and markets that tacitly contain and convey implicit knowledge within a liberal framework. It is very much another insistence of the general pattern of ideological division that we have traced back to Burke and Paine's era. For all that they have certainly evolved over 2 centuries, the two sides of our politics still often express the basic underlying dispositions toward progress and tradition, choice and obligation, technocratic prowess and a worldly skepticism, evident in Paine and Burke. When it is most itself, each of our parties rather plainly fits the profile that emerges from our study of the great debate of the age of revolutions. It may be strange to think that just a few layers beneath our bubbling and contentious political debates, there still lurk such profound questions of political philosophy. But as both the lives and the arguments of Burke and Paine help show us, political events are always tied up with political ideas, and seeing those ties can shed a bright light on both the events and the ideas. Philosophy moves history, especially in times of profound social change, and ours, like Burke's and Paine's, is surely such a time. Burke and Paine agreed that politics is always in flux, and that the challenge of the statesman is to govern change for the benefit of society. The practical questions that divided them and shaped their assorted theoretical explorations and arguments began from this basic reality. But to what ends and by what means should people alter their political and cultural arrangements? Burke and Paine's debate may not provide an ultimate answer, but it offers an unusually deep and serious engagement with a question we must still confront. In our day-to-day political arguments, we hear echoes of a deeper debate that we easily mistake for remnants of an argument between capitalism and socialism, or for faint precursors of a long-predicted ultimate clash between religious traditionalism and secular cosmopolitanism. But more likely, these echoes are in fact reminders of the defining disagreement of the political order of modern liberalism. That disagreement was given early and unusually clear voice by Edmund Burke and Thomas Paine, and becomes far easier to comprehend when we pay careful attention to what they have to teach us. This concludes the reading of The Great Debate, Edmund Burke, Thomas Paine, and the Birth of Right and Left, by Yuval Levin. Copyright 2014 by Yuval Levin. This book was read by Mike Chamberlain. This unabridged recording was published by arrangement with Basic Books, a member of the Perseus Books Group, and was produced in 2013 by AudioGo, which holds the copyright. Neither this recording nor any portion of it may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authorization from AudioGo. If you would like to obtain a monthly update telling you about new releases, call 1-800-621-0182. For a complete listing of our titles, visit our website at www.downpour.com. Thank you.